Today on the Ortho Perspective, we're joined a second time by Dr. Brian Fuller. Um, and I thought it'd be interesting to have him. Dr. Fuller just got back from the fourth annual World Arthroplasty Conference in Madrid, Spain. And I just want to get an American's perspective on an international meeting. So, welcome back.
Oh, thanks for having me. Um,
Absolutely. So, first question is, have you recovered from your trip a couple weeks ago? I know it was a
yeah,
very
right.
rapid trip.
Yeah, I'm doing good. Jet lag's a real thing, and I don't know how some of the more prominent key opinion leaders, are at every meeting and travel across time zones and internationally. It's really amazing, to be quite honest with you, because I was dead when I got back. There's no doubt,
Right. Well,
no doubt.
you just need endurance. Got to do it over and over again, I guess.
Right, right,
So,
right.
um, I know you don't have the exact breakdown of American surgeons that were there versus international. I looked up the agenda, and it seemed like there were a fair amount of American presenters. Can you kind of break down what your sense was?
I I mean, I don't wanna embellish. I may have been the only paid American at that conference. There were several Americans presenting and in the audience asking thoughtful questions. I'm pretty sure all of them besides me gave some sort of presentation at the meeting.
Yeah.
So I think there was 900 people registered for the meeting. I would guess 899 of them were, European or non-North American.
Yeah. So even if you missed a couple, predominantly European, not non-American, um, you know, what I guess let's start with knees. What are kind of the topics that are going on internationally that may have surprised you compared to what's happening in the US?
Uh, there was a paper presented regarding the carbon footprint of arthroplasty, which didn't get a lot of play or a lot of questions. But I was like, I don't even know if that's on anybody's radar in the United States as far as how much gas and carbon and whatever we're emitting, taking both freight and then patient travel to and from the surgery. Somehow they had calculated it, and I don't know. I just kind of like my eyes rolled back and I couldn't think straight. I think the discussion regarding customized implants is a little bit I don't know if advanced is the right word or accepted in Europe. Symbiose, which is an alternative to conformis, is the same price in France as off the shelf implants. And there's a couple opinion leaders who promote and utilize that technology, and so I think it's a little bit more prominent, specifically in France than certainly in the United States, and so that was interesting to me. And then the alignment discussion that surrounds total knee, both in the United States, is also prominent in Europe. They took a small poll. There was a morning session where they kind of had people using various alignment philosophies give their kind of take on why they do what they do and why they think it's the best. And they took a show of hands in the audience who was doing what. Very, very few mechanically aligned total knees, but there were several people in the crowd. And actually, to their credit, they had a presenter from Germany give an opinion like why I still do a mechanical alignment and why I think it's a good idea. And he gave a pretty good argument. But the overwhelming majority of the people in the audience were doing some sort of robotic assisted
Hmm.
functional alignment. And I think if you took that same poll at AUKUS, I mean, there are people doing that, but I don't think it would be the majority. And I don't know if that has to do with, I don't know, the influence of um, Mako and other robots Rosa in Europe. I don't know if they're at major academic centers and so more trainees are already using them, or if the editor of prominent journals over there happens to be a user, if that influences people. I don't really know, but certainly robots were used by most panelists. Yeah.
Yeah, that is actually very interesting to hear because I 100% agree with you. While I do think and understand, as most people would, technology usage in joints is just going to keep increasing percentage wise. I mean, for obvious reasons, the big thing here is how do you get the cost and the time neutrality. Um, and
Yeah.
and maybe that's part of it, is that the practice of medicine in a lot of European companies looks far different than it does in the US as far as
It's true. I guess I didn't specifically talk to people about volume, but you're right. I think many places, their income is not necessarily tied to volume, and there's not a huge push to do more, more, more. And so the added time of a robot is maybe not as cumbersome. It's
right,
also interesting though with the an audience that doesn't like, who are they marketing to, right? You're in nationalized healthcare, you have to go see whoever's employed by the government. Like,
right,
how is the robot a marketing tool? I don't really understand. You kind of have a captive audience. Um, on the flip side of that, there's a gentleman from India who did 30 total knee replacements in a day. Like, what? Clearly bilateral knee replacements are much more common, and I think 14 of the 16 patients he operated on that day got bilaterals. But I mean, I can't even fathom that kind of volume. I guess when you're doing both, you don't have to worry about doing the wrong side. But anyway.
you still got to worry about putting the correct side in the patient, though.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to me that technology would be much more, I guess, embraced there. You mentioned robotics. Was there much talk about other technology, navigation, or is it
Yeah.
strongly robotics?
I mean, my feeling at the meeting was the bias was towards robotics and less so navigation, probably because, the shiny new object syndrome. Out in the hall, the exhibit hall, if you will, was really a hall, not a huge conference room full
Mhm.
of 1,000 different vendors. They had little smaller setups where you could kind of see the various robots and various implants, but that part of the meeting was much, much less commercial than AUKUS or AAOS for sure. But I didn't get the impression that some of the per case navigation solutions that are commonly used in the United States are rampant there. I didn't get that impression at all. There were several people promoting, manual instruments doing kinematically aligned knees, and then um, some people doing robots with different manufacturers. I should take that back though, because I think older navigation that's been around, they just have it in their hospital, and so they weren't promoting it, but many of them do it.
Gotcha.
So like the gentleman who described restrictive kinematic alignment, I think is in Italy, maybe even Toli. I'm pretty sure all the papers he wrote, they use navigation, but that wasn't really as discussed at the meeting.
Yeah. So, uh, on this is a knee and a hip question, but are they as adamant and embracing of um, getting patients out the same day, home the same day as us
No,
in America?
nobody, nobody. I mean, no, I think there are surgeons who would like to do that, but I mean, I think in Germany the standard stay is still greater than a week, like 10
Wow.
days. I think there are some people doing like 1 night stays or 2 night stays, but I don't think there's um I don't think there's a lot of same day surgery currently in Europe now.
Yeah. So, were you able to have a conversation with any of the European surgeons just on differences practicing in the
Yeah,
US
I mean,
compared to
part of the
there?
reason I was going, I did a British Hip Society traveling fellowship, and so the colleague that I traveled with there, Wim Reinen, is a hip surgeon in Nijmegen, which is like a tertiary referral center in Holland. And so we, drank beers and talked about all the things, catching up about life, but also about, current practice. The most fascinating thing about his practice to me, in addition to just being very like stereotypically European in that his wait list is 6+ months long and he takes month-long vacations and things that just don't exist in the United States. He is the end of the road, right? He's the tertiary referral center there. And for an aseptic revision, two-thirds of his practice is revision hip
Ooh.
arthroplasty. For an aseptic revision, if you have a BMI over 35, you don't get scheduled.
Wow. So
Literally, that stopped the conversation. I was like, "Oh, I should stop eating. I'm probably pretty close to 35 right now." Like, that's wild.
yeah, that's wild. And I know I've talked with people internationally, and I know for years the US had a fatter population, but I've heard people from the UK say that they're catching us. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's not, contagious the way COVID may or may not be,
yeah,
but clearly everybody is getting fatter. That being said, as soon as I landed, the general population, of people at the hotel was thinner than the general population in the US. I
yeah,
mean, I think the number of people with a BMI over 35 in Holland is probably still less than the number of people with a BMI over 40 in the United States. And so it's not that exclusive or restrictive, but just interesting the difference in practice.
yeah. That's because Holland, they're just a lot of tall people over there.
They are tall. Smoking is more accepted, right? And
Really?
and obesity less accepted. It begs the question, which is worse, right?
Yeah.
Would you rather take care of a BMI 40 patient or a pack a day smoker patient? And I don't know the right answer, but
Yeah.
uh, yeah,
Right. That I mean, all this is very interesting to me. Just from the standpoint, like thinking through the American mindset. You're not going to do a revision hip on someone with a BMI over 35. You said. I mean,
that's his cutoff. Yeah.
I mean that's crazy. Is the same true for him on the knee side?
Well, that's the European model. He only operates on hips
Oh,
there.
he
He's a hip
okay.
surgeon only. He doesn't even do knees. Now, that is a division within Europe that's different because the guys in Belgium and Austria, they do both hips and knees, but other places, guys are only doing hips or only doing knees.
Yeah. So on the hip side, I'm going to ask the same basic question. What was there anything that surprised you on the hip side or stood out to you about, the European, the international philosophy on anything compared to the US?
No, I mean, I guess the amount of excitement regarding robotics and three-dimensional planning kind of crosses both. I mean, the whole thing was talking about really three-dimensional planning and reconstruction, which clearly, all the talk about kinematic alignment in the knee is all referring to the coronal plane, and the anterior compartment is clearly affected by what you do, both in the coronal and sagittal plane. And the same is true in the hip. I think version of the stem is a little less well, or I shouldn't say less well understood. We know that we are not recreating native stem or femoral torsion slash anaversion, and it varies from patient to patient, sometimes very widely. And I think most people use the same stem with a fixed, angle in 95% of people. And so that clearly has some altered mechanics. I don't know. It wasn't really as discussed at the meeting, but to me, that's the most fascinating part of kind of custom implants is if you could customize an implant to match a patient's version, now you've got a truly, close to
Right.
anatomic reconstruction. And I think the rising excitement around hip resurfacing becomes even more nuanced because if there is an advantage to hip resurfacing, it's exactly that you are exactly matching native femoral torsion slash anaversion because head size probably at some point is a diminishing return. We're getting 40 and 44 millimeter heads. If you put in a 50 millimeter resurfacing, I don't know that that's really moving the needle as far as stability is concerned.
Yeah. Um, which resurfacing, that is another question. What is the percentage of the people that maybe you interacted with or your friend who's a hip surgeon, you know, how big of a deal is resurfacing these days internationally?
I don't that wasn't a big part of the meeting at all. It's interesting the resurgence of hip resurfacing or the seeming resurgence of it, I think has a lot to do with technology, potentially the ability to do uh, polyethylene as part of the
Mhm.
construct, but there was not a lot of attention towards that. Now, clearly, there are, just like in America, there are places where people do a lot of hip resurfacing. Um, Again, I have nothing to support this at all, but my gestalt was that there are a few centers that do a lot of it and not a lot of people doing it just casually. Very similar to the United States.
Yeah. Um, so obviously, I think there's the commonality from orthopedic surgeons, whether in the US or there, is that they truly do want to do what's best for their patient. And what I find fascinating about this whole thing is just how different outside the OR is, the business side of it. As you mentioned before, I mean, the guy you did the traveling fellowship with, he's a hip only surgeon, and anybody within a certain geography is funneled to him.
Yeah.
And, you know, is that the main reason why you believe that they're have a different attitude, even lengths of stay, or and all of that?
Economics certainly play a role. All, yeah, I mean, questions change, the answer the same as money for sure. I think most people are recognizing now there's nothing magical or even beneficial in staying at the hospital for a prolonged period. Most complications that happen don't happen the day of surgery. And so they're, having a nurse wake you up every 3 hours in a hospital bed to tell you you're still alive is not helpful. Um, uh, the economics of everything else are fascinating, right? Who pays for the robot? Who pays for this? Who pays for the custom implants? Who pays for all that stuff? I think they're recognizing the economics of it too. There's the geographic differences in pricing across the Atlantic Ocean and across country lines is difficult to interpret and understand, right? Like
Mhm.
antibiotic loaded cement in Europe is much cheaper than it is here, and I'm pretty sure that's not related to a tariff. I just the pricing is set uniquely for some reason. Um, yeah, they definitely, most people wanna believe they're doing what's right for patients. I think the other thing that's different that I didn't mention is y partial knee replacement is still way more common in Europe than here, and
Mhm.
so when you're interpreting literature and looking at data, one alignment philosophy versus another alignment philosophy, it's hard to discount, like, in Europe, when they're comparing the patients who were left after 30, 40, 50% of those patients got partial knees. So maybe patients with more advanced pathology than in the United States, where only 4% of primary knees are partial knees, and then we're doing total knees on them. And so it's not the same patient population they're comparing, I guess, is interesting.
Yeah. So in closing here, well, first of all, are you planning on making this an annual event for
Oh, well,
yourself?
first of all, it's not an annual event. I
Oh,
think it's
it's
every
not?
second or third year. No, it's not an every year event. And the reason I went is because originally, it was supposed to be in Munich, I think in 2021, and my co-fellows and I said, "Oh, let's meet up at a meeting. Hey, there's this World Arthroplasty Congress in Munich. We can go. This would be awesome." And then it was virtual, it wasn't a very good meeting, and nobody went. And then we said, okay, let's go to the next one. And I'm the only one that went, so whatever. But it was fun. It was fun anyway. So
But was it worthwhile that the next one comes around, you'll think about it, maybe enticed by maybe your friends get together for that one?
oh, I think I will. I mean, I think it's fascinating to get different
Mhm.
perspectives on things. And clearly, there are things they think about, whether economically driven or whatever, are different than the things that I'm thinking about daily in my system, and all in effort to improve patient care. And so, yes, I mean, I think the more wide you can cast that net to try and learn things. Now, clearly, LinkedIn has made the world a little bit
Mhm.
smaller. There's a lot more interaction with providers in Europe and in Asia, than I had, just a year ago. And so it's a little bit smaller that way, but I would definitely consider going again. I
Yeah.
wish, in a very European fashion, they only have meetings during the weekdays. because nobody will show up on the weekends. That's like protected time. And in the United States, like I'd much prefer AUKUSes or surrounds a weekend because
Right.
I don't have to take as much time off of work. And so I don't, the cultural differences are real.
Right.
That part is fascinating.
Well, the one way we can get around that to make all the meetings, midweek in the US is if we just start carving out like everybody in Dallas in these zip codes have to go to Brian Fuller.
Yeah, right.
That
Right. Yeah.
that would make
Control
it correct. So
for sure.
you mentioned LinkedIn. You're active on LinkedIn. Did anybody recognize Brian Fuller from the US?
You're a jerk. One person, I think one person maybe said, "Oh, Brian from LinkedIn." Clearly, I spend too much time on that website, and
Yeah.
anyway,
It
that's
it's
funny.
it, it is pretty funny, but as you mentioned, it has made the world smaller within the orthopedic community, and we have gotten more perspective of the international surgeons than ever before.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
For the better, I think. I think it's great to hear what people are doing elsewhere and what
Yeah.
works and doesn't work. And it's really interesting to hear in the background. The regulations to do research in Europe are becoming much more difficult. And so some of the bench research or early clinical research that historically has been done there first may in fact end up coming back to the United States
Hmm.
because somehow the FDA is better than the system that they're currently working through.
Yes.
And so it'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves and changes in the next few years as well.
Yeah, which I have heard the same thing on the approval side of devices is that the US is now easier than the EU to get
Yeah.
to get the mark in Europe.
Yeah,
So,
I don't know what it is they want. I don't I just
correct.
learned the word 510K recently, so I don't know
Right.
anything about approvals,
Well,
but
my understanding is they want X amount of years of implants being used and followed, um, which is different than here in the U.S. So anyway, in closing, if anybody wants to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
I mean, if you're watching this, you're probably already on LinkedIn, but feel free to DM me or connect with me on LinkedIn for sure.
Right.
Um, I, like my wife says, I'm a little too active on there, but I'm happy to try and get back to
All right. Sounds good. Well, I appreciate your time, Dr. Fuller, and we'll talk again soon.
you. Yes, sir.